Listen, I want you to picture two tablets side by side. On the left, the words you already know: Noah, the Ark, 40 days and 40 nights. On the right, a small clay tablet about the size of a cell phone, covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform marks, dug out of the ground in Mesopotamia and translated by a British museum curator named Irving Finkel in 2014. Same story, older story. And once you put them side by side, you cannot unsee what's different. I taught world history for 12 years at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. I taught the flood story to teenagers every single year as if it were the first story ever told about a global catastrophe and a righteous man who survived it. Nobody in that curriculum, not once, mentioned that the Sumerians and the Babylonians were writing this exact same narrative structure at least 800 years before the book of Genesis took its current written form. Not a footnote, not a side comment. Silence. And here's the thing that broke something open in me. It wasn't that the parallel existed. Scholars have known about this since 1872. It's that an institution built entirely on the pursuit of truth chose, generation after generation, to leave that truth out of the lesson plan. So today, I want to walk you through exactly what I found, in the order I found it, because the order matters. We're going to look at the version everyone knows. Then we're going to go back further to a flood story that predates it by centuries, discovered on a broken tablet in a place called Nippur. Then we're going to go even further, to a recently translated tablet that describes an ark shaped nothing like the one in your Bible illustrations, an ark that is, frankly, more technically detailed than the one supposedly dictated by God. And at the end, I'm going to tell you about a Victorian Assyriologist who got so excited reading a cuneiform tablet in the British Museum that witnesses say he started tearing off his clothes. Because that moment, 1872, is where this whole rabbit hole began, and I think it's exactly where you need to sit with it too. Before we go further, if this is the kind of history that the classroom left out of your education too, do me a favor and hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps YouTube understand that people want this kind of investigation, the kind that doesn't flatten complicated history into a Sunday school poster, and it tells the algorithm to put this in front of more people who are asking the same questions you are. Here's the sentence I want you to remember for the rest of this video. The flood didn't start with Noah. Noah was a rewrite. Let's start with what you already know, because we need the familiar version on the table before we can see what's underneath it. Genesis chapters 6 through 9. God looks at humanity, sees corruption and violence everywhere, and regrets making them. He selects one righteous man, Noah, and instructs him to build an ark of gopher wood, coated in pitch, with specific but limited dimensions. 2 of every animal, 7 pairs of the clean ones. 40 days and nights of rain. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah releases a raven, then a dove, 3 times, until the dove doesn't come back. He builds an altar, sacrifices a clean animal, and God promises never to flood the whole earth again, sealing the promise with a rainbow. That's the version taught in almost every Sunday school in the English-speaking world. That's the version I taught, verse by verse, for over a decade. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 1872, a man named George Smith, who had no university degree and had taught himself to read cuneiform by studying tablets during his lunch breaks while working as an engraver, stood in front of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The audience included the sitting Prime Minister, William Gladstone. Smith announced that he had found on a tablet dug up in the ruins of Nineveh a Babylonian account of a flood that was, in its structure, almost identical to the one in Genesis. A boat, a warning from a divine source, animals loaded aboard, a landing on a mountain, birds sent out to check for dry land, a sacrifice afterward. The room reportedly went into an uproar. The story goes that Smith was so overcome reading the tablet for the first time that he began undressing in the middle of the museum. Whether that detail is exactly accurate or slightly embellished by history, what is documented is this. The Daily Telegraph newspaper was so captivated that it put up 1,000 guineas, worth something like $150,000 today, to fund an expedition back to Nineveh just to find the missing pieces of that tablet. Think about that for a second. A newspaper funded an archaeological dig because the implications of one clay tablet were considered a national emergency for Victorian England's understanding of its own scripture. That's not a footnote you bury in a textbook. That's the moment the entire question got forced into the open and it never really closed again. But this story didn't start in Nineveh either. To understand where it actually goes, we need to go back further than Smith's tablet, further than the Babylonians who wrote it. We need to go to Nippur, in what is now Iraq, and to the year 1893, when archaeologists pulled a badly damaged tablet out of the ground, one that would eventually be catalogued as CBS 10673. It sat, fragmented, for over 2 decades, until a scholar named Arno Pobel translated it in 1914. This is the Eridu Genesis, and it may be the oldest written flood account we currently have access to. In this version, the hero isn't Noah. He isn't even Utnapishtim, the name most people who've heard of the Babylonian flood story recognize from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Eridu Genesis, he's called Ziusudra, a priest-king of a city called Shuruppak. The god Enki, working around a divine order not to warn humanity, speaks to Ziusudra through a wall, essentially whispering the warning sideways so that, technically, he never broke the rule against telling a human directly. Ziusudra builds a boat. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days. Afterward, Ziusudra offers a sacrifice, and here's the detail. Your Sunday school curriculum and mine conveniently skipped. Ziusudra doesn't just get to walk off the boat and start over. He is granted eternal life. He's given a home in a paradise called Dilmun. Noah, in contrast, gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and ends up cursing his own grandson in a scene most people who grew up in church were never actually taught in detail because it's uncomfortable and doesn't fit neatly on a poster. 2/3 of that Nippur tablet is damaged beyond recovery, which means the version we have isn't even the full original. We are working with fragments of fragments, and still, the skeleton of the story, divine warning, boat, flood, landing, sacrifice, divine response, is unmistakably the same shape as the one you learned as a child. Picture the city of Shuruppak itself for a second, because it's a real place, not a legend floating in myth. Archaeologists have actually excavated it in what is now southern Iraq, and beneath the layers of ordinary occupation, debris, pottery shards, foundation walls, the remains of daily life, there is a distinct band of water-laid silt, sometimes measured at several feet thick, sitting right where the Ziusudra story says, catastrophe struck. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating nearby at Ur in the 1920s, found a similar silt deposit and initially announced it to the world press as physical proof of the biblical flood itself. Later analysis walked that claim back. The silt band at Ur doesn't line up in time with the silt band at Shuruppak, and neither one covers the wider region uniformly, the way a global planet-covering flood would have to. What the evidence actually supports is something narrower, and in its own way, more interesting. A series of severe, catastrophic, city-flattening river floods at different times, in different cities, along the Tigris and Euphrates flood plain, each one devastating enough to end up preserved in the memory of the people who survived it, and each one eventually feeding into the same evolving story. That's an important distinction, and it's one I had to sit with for a while before it actually clicked. The ancient scribes weren't necessarily lying when they wrote about a flood that felt like it swallowed the whole world. If you are a Bronze Age farmer in Shuruppak and the Euphrates rises high enough to destroy every home you have ever known, the entire world, as far as you personally have ever seen it, actually has ended. The story isn't fabricated out of nothing. It's a real, lived catastrophe, remembered and retold, generation after generation, until the geography got bigger than the actual event and the theology got attached to explain why it happened. Now you might be thinking, okay, but maybe this just proves the flood really happened, and different cultures independently remembered a real historical catastrophe. I wrestled with this exact question for years, because it's the argument every apologetics website reaches for first, and it deserves a real answer, not a dismissal. Here's the problem with that explanation. Scholars including W.G. Lambert, who along with A.R. Millard produced the definitive critical edition of the Atrahasis tablets in 1969, traced something more specific than shared cultural memory. They traced a textual lineage. Sumerian Ziusudra becomes Akkadian Atrahasis, becomes the flood narrative embedded in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, becomes, centuries later, Genesis chapters 6 through 9. That's not four cultures independently recalling the same regional flood. That's a chain of copying and adaptation, the same way a story gets retold and reshaped as it passes from one storyteller's mouth to the next, except this time we can actually read the manuscripts at each stage of the chain, and it's not just structure that lines up. It's specific plot beats in the specific order. Divine warning to one man. Construction of a vessel with waterproofing. Loading of animals. A flood that wipes out the rest of humanity. A landing on a mountain. The release of birds in a sequence to test for dry land. A sacrifice upon disembarking. A divine response to that sacrifice. If two students turn in essays with the exact same 7-point outline in the exact same order, you don't conclude they both independently arrived at the identical structure. You ask who copied from whom or who copied from a common source. Let's do the math here, because the math is the part that actually settles it for me. The Atrahasis tablets are physically dated to around 1646 to 1626 BC, based on the writing style and archaeological context of the clay itself. The Book of Genesis, in the form we have it today, was composed and compiled from multiple source traditions, what scholars call J and P, no earlier than somewhere between the 10th and 6th centuries BC. That is a gap of 800 to 1,000 years between the Mesopotamian tablets and the written form of the biblical account. The cuneiform tablets are not a comment on Genesis. They predate Genesis by the better part of a millennium. And the version that came first has, if anything, more mechanical and technical detail than the version that came after it, not less, which is the opposite of what you'd expect if the Bible were the simple original and the Mesopotamian myths were later, more elaborate corruptions of it. This is where the sums stop adding up if you want to hold on to the idea that Genesis wrote the flood story first, and everyone else copied a simplified version of a divine original. The dates don't allow it, the physical clay doesn't allow it, and the details actually go the wrong direction for that theory to survive contact with the evidence. I'll be honest with you, this is the part that's hard to say, but I've decided I'm not going to hide it from you the way it was hidden from me. When I first sat with this timeline, really sat with it, alone after hours in a classroom I'd stood in front of for over a decade, something in me went quiet in a way it hadn't before. Not because I stopped believing in God. I want to be completely clear about that, because I know exactly what conclusion some of you are already jumping to. It's because I realized the distance between what the evidence actually says and what I had been handed to teach was not an accident of omission. Somebody, at some point in the last 200 years of religious education, made a decision to simplify this into silence, and that decision was made for me, and through me, to thousands of 14-year-olds who trusted that I was giving them the whole picture. Now, if you think I've made an error anywhere in how I've laid out this timeline, tell me in the comments. I want the pushback. I'd rather have this conversation in the open with people who disagree than pretend there's no room for debate here. But there's a part of this story that goes even deeper than the Ziusudra tablet from Nippur. And it's the part that made me stop being able to look at Sunday school illustrations of Noah's Ark the same way ever again. In 2014, Irving Finkel, a curator at the British Museum who has spent his career reading cuneiform tablets that most people will never see outside a glass case, published a book called The Ark Before Noah. In it, he presents his translation of what's now called the Ark Tablet, dated to somewhere around 1900 to 1700 BC. This tablet is genuinely small, about the size of a smartphone, 60 lines of cuneiform script, and what it describes is not a rectangular wooden box like the one in every children's Bible you've ever flipped through. It describes a massive coracle, a round boat, built from coiled rope, waterproofed with bitumen, the same tar-like substance used in ancient Mesopotamian construction and shipbuilding. The tablet gives actual measurements, actual material quantities, an actual construction method, an engineering document, essentially, for how to build a giant circular vessel that floats. Sit with that for a second, because here's the paradox that doesn't seem like it should make sense, but does the moment you understand why. A supposedly divinely dictated account, one written down by human hands claiming direct instruction from God, gives us far less structural and technical detail than a Bronze Age clay tablet describing how to waterproof a rope boat with tar. The version that claims the most supernatural authority is the version with the least engineering specificity. The version with no claim to divine dictation at all is the one that reads like an actual construction manual. Think of it this way. Imagine two people describing how to build the same house. One of them is a licensed contractor handing you a blueprint, exact measurements, load calculations, the specific sealant needed for the roof joints, because the contractor's entire job depends on the house actually not leaking. The other is a preacher, decades later, telling the story of that same house from a pulpit to make a point about faith and obedience, and mentioning only that the house was built, that it was sound, and that the man who built it trusted the instructions he was given. Both descriptions can be true. Both can even be describing the same original house. But you would never mistake the sermon for the blueprint, and you would never expect the sermon to contain the technical detail that only the contractor had a reason to write down. Finkel's Ark tablet reads like the blueprint. Genesis reads like the sermon. That's not an accident of who was more honest. That's a difference in what each document was actually for. Why would that be true if Genesis were simply the original, unadorned account of a real historical vessel? It's a strange thing to leave out if you actually built the thing. But it makes complete sense if what you're reading in Genesis is not a construction record. It's a theological retelling, written by authors who cared enormously about the moral meaning of the story and comparatively little about its engineering specifications, because they weren't writing a shipbuilding manual. They were adapting an existing narrative for a very different theological purpose. And that brings us to the piece of this that I think matters more than any individual tablet. Why would ancient scribes do this on purpose? Because I don't think what happened here was theft, and I don't think it was fraud, and I think that's the frame that gets lost every time this topic turns into an internet argument. Here's the pattern scholars call desacralization, or sometimes demythologization, and once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere in ancient literature, not just in the Bible. When a culture inherits a well-known story from a neighboring or preceding civilization, it doesn't usually invent something from nothing. It takes the existing narrative skeleton, because that skeleton already carries cultural weight and recognition, and it replaces the theology inside that skeleton with its own. In the Mesopotamian versions, the flood comes because humanity has grown too numerous and too loud, literally too noisy, and it's disturbing the sleep of the gods. That's it. That's the reason. Not sin, not moral corruption, noise. The gods in these versions are petty, capricious, divided against each other, arguing about whether wiping out humanity was even a good idea after the fact. The biblical authors took that same skeleton, divine warning, boat, flood, landing, birds, sacrifice, promise, and they replaced petty, quarreling, noise-averse gods with a single, moral God who floods the earth because of genuine ethical corruption, and who makes a binding covenant afterward, sealed with a rainbow, never to do it again. That's not plagiarism in the way we use that word today. That's a civilization taking a widely known regional narrative and using it as a vehicle to make an entirely different theological argument. The same story shape, carrying an entirely different meaning. Think about that for a second because it reframes the whole question. The interesting part was never really, did they copy the plot? Scholars settled that decades ago by simply reading the dates on the clay. The interesting part is what they changed and why, and what that change tells you about what those ancient authors actually believed mattered. I've spent time with the work of people like Bart Ehrman on how texts get transmitted and altered, and Kenneth Kitchen, who actually argues the opposite position from what I've laid out here, that the flood narrative reflects a shared historical memory rather than late literary borrowing. I want to be fair to that argument because it deserves acknowledgement, not dismissal. Kitchen's case is that the theological differences are too fundamental for direct literary dependence, that Genesis represents an independent memory of a real regional flood event around the same era the Mesopotamian tablets were written. It's a serious scholarly position held by a serious scholar. But Lambert's textual lineage work, the tablet-by-tablet chain from Ziusudra to Atrahasis to Gilgamesh's Tablet 11 to Genesis, and the precision of the structural parallels, the exact sequence of warning, boat, animals, flood, mountain, birds, sacrifice, promise. In that order, across every version, is difficult to explain as pure coincidence of independent memory. When you have that many identical plot beats in that precise an order across 4 separate literary traditions, independent memory becomes the less economical explanation, not the more economical one. And if you think this is just an isolated coincidence in one region of the ancient world, it isn't. Flood narratives with structurally similar shapes appear across cultures that share river-valley geography prone to catastrophic flooding, the Tigris and Euphrates river system chief among them. But cultures without that same geographic and hydrological backdrop, Aboriginal Australian traditions, most sub-Saharan African oral traditions, don't share the same universal flood survivor narrative structure at anywhere near the same density. That's not proof of a single global cataclysm remembered everywhere. That's a pattern consistent with regional river flooding in a specific river system, generating a specific family of stories, which then got passed hand to hand, tablet to tablet, culture to culture, for close to 2,000 years before reaching the form you were handed as a child. I remember finding a version of this exact argument buried in a footnote of a textbook I was assigned to teach from, years before I ever left that school. It was one line, easy to skip over if you were moving fast through a lesson plan on a Friday afternoon. A brief mention that some scholars note parallels with earlier Near Eastern flood accounts. That's the entire acknowledgement. One clause, no explanation, no tablet named, no dates given, buried in small print at the bottom of a page. Most students and most teachers never actually stop to read. I taught from that book for years before I circled back and asked myself what exactly that sentence was quietly admitting, and what it was clearly hoping nobody would follow up on. Have you ever wondered why this particular story, out of everything in the ancient world, survived this many retellings across this many centuries? I think it's because a story about deserving destruction and undeserved mercy is one of the most durable narrative structures human beings have ever produced. It doesn't matter whether the gods are one or many, whether the reason is sin or noise. The shape of the story, judgment survived by grace, is the part that keeps getting passed down, generation after generation, culture after culture, because it answers something in people that doesn't go away. And that's exactly where this story stops being ancient history and starts being about your life right now. Because whether you grew up in a church like the one I taught in, or you grew up completely outside religious tradition and are encountering this whole conversation for the first time today, the question this story keeps asking across 4,000 years of retelling is the same question. When everything that deserves to be washed away actually gets washed away, is there mercy left standing on the other side of it? That's not a question that belongs only to Bronze Age Mesopotamia. That's a question every single person watching this video is already living inside in some form, whether it's about a mistake you made, a version of yourself you're trying to leave behind, or a fear that judgment is coming and nothing will be left standing afterward. If you've made it this far into this video, you're already in a small group. Most people who've heard the phrase Noah's Ark have never heard the name Ziusudra, never heard of the Atrahasis tablets, never heard of the Ark tablet's round coracle design, and they never will. Because most religious education, mine included for the 12 years I taught it, simply doesn't go there. You now know where this story actually came from, how it moved from Sumerian temple archives to Akkadian tablets to the Nineveh library that George Smith excavated to the Hebrew scriptures compiled centuries later. You know the mechanism, desacralization, the same skeleton with different theology inside it. The only thing that separates knowing this from actually sitting with what it means for your own understanding of Scripture is one thing: the willingness to actually look at it instead of looking away. I need to tell you about something that happened after I resigned from that teaching position, because it's the moment that eventually led me here, to this channel, to J.J. Benítez's work, and to everything I've spent the last several years investigating. A colleague of mine, a Spanish-speaking teacher I'd worked alongside for years, handed me a stack of books during a conversation about why I'd left, almost as an afterthought, the way you hand someone a book you think they need without making a big deal out of it. Benítez's investigations into biblical history, the historical Jesus, the space between what institutions teach and what the documentary and archaeological record actually shows, cracked something open that the flood story had already started cracking. I haven't stopped digging since. Not because I lost my faith, because the institution that taught me to seek truth punished me the moment I actually found some. That tension, love for the substance of what I was taught to believe, and anger at the people who decided I didn't need the full picture to believe it well, is the reason this channel exists at all. And it's exactly why we put together something for people who feel that same pull, the desire to actually go deeper instead of accepting the simplified version. The Spinoza Forever Library, 5 volumes, isn't a Sunday school workbook. It's a curated collection built for people who want the layered version of these investigations, the historical context, the primary source framing, the kind of material that doesn't stop at "here's the story," but keeps going into where the story actually came from and what scholars on every side of the debate have argued about it. Thousands of people investigating this exact same territory have already worked through it. It's linked in the description and pinned in the comments below, and right now it's priced as part of a limited run, so if this is the kind of digging you want to keep doing after this video ends, don't wait on it. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. So here's the debate that consumed Victorian England in 1872. Was George Smith's tablet proof that the Bible was historically true because an independent Babylonian source confirmed the same catastrophe? Or was it proof that the Bible had borrowed, adapted, and retold an older story for its own theological purpose? That debate started the moment Smith stood up in front of Gladstone and the Society of Biblical Archaeology, and as far as I can tell, it has never actually been resolved. Scholars still argue both sides today, with better tools and older tablets than Smith ever had access to. I'm not going to tell you which side of that debate to land on. I've told you what the clay says, what the dates say, and what the structure of the story says across 4,000 years of retelling. What you do with that is genuinely yours to decide, not mine. That's it. That's the question. I'll let you sit with that. If you want to argue with me about any piece of this, the dating, the textual lineage, the desacralization theory, put it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'd genuinely rather hear where you think I've gotten it wrong than have you walk away agreeing with something you haven't actually tested. And if there's a part of this story, Ziusudra's immortality, the Ark Tablet's round design, George Smith's discovery itself, that you want a full video on, tell me which one, because there's a lot more buried in these tablets than one video can hold. You decide what to do with this. I'll be here when you're ready to keep digging.